I held the lapels of my gray suit, feeling the coarse thread beneath my fingers, knowing that every single stitch had been guided by the hands of my late wife, Sarah, before she left this world. To the wealthy crowd gathering around us, I was just an old, out-of-place man wearing a faded, outdated jacket. But to me, this suit was my armor, a physical piece of the only woman I ever loved, and I wanted her with me as our daughter, Chloe, walked down the aisle. Sarah had tailored this suit by hand decades ago, during a time when we survived on hope and hard work, long before I quietly built my real estate empire from the ground up. I chose to live modestly, keeping my success hidden from the public eye, because true strength does not need to boast. The Grand Horizon estate loomed ahead, a towering monument of glass and marble perched on the cliffs. It was a place designed to scream of luxury and prestige, the very definition of a gilded cage. I stood near the entrance, watching the high society guests arrive in their designer silk dresses and custom tuxedos, their laughter floating through the air. I did not care about their wealth or their hollow status. I only cared about Chloe, my precious daughter, who deserved nothing but happiness on her special day. But my quiet moment of memory and anticipation was instantly shattered. "What on earth do you think you are wearing?" The voice cut through the air like cold steel. I turned to see Beatrice, the mother of the groom, gliding toward me. Her face was contorted in a mixture of disgust and sheer panic, as if my presence alone was a contagious disease. She stopped inches from me, her eyes scanning my worn grey suit with venomous intensity. Several nearby guests paused their conversations, turning to watch the unfolding drama. "Is this some kind of sick joke, Arthur?" Beatrice hissed, her voice dripping with condescension. "This is an ultra-exclusive high-society wedding, not a charity soup kitchen. That fabric looks like it was salvaged from a dusty cellar. You look like a common beggar who wandered onto the property by mistake." I felt a tight knot form in my chest, but my face remained entirely calm, my years of business negotiations teaching me never to show weakness. I swallowed my pride, keeping my voice low and controlled. This suit was hand-stitched by my late wife, Beatrice. It holds more value to me than this entire estate. She let out a sharp, mocking laugh that echoed off the marble walls. "Sentimentality does not pay for a luxury venue, Arthur. Your cheap, shabby appearance is an absolute embarrassment to my son and our family's reputation. Look around you. These are business leaders and influential investors. I will not have you ruining our social standing with your pathetic outfit. If you insist on staying, you will sit in the absolute back, completely hidden behind the floral arrangements where no one has to look at you. If you dare to step out of line, I will personally have security throw you out onto the street." With a final, contemptuous glare, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me standing alone under the judging eyes of the high society crowd. The sting of Beatrice's words did not wound my pride, but they tore open a quiet compartment of my heart that I had kept guarded for years. I looked down at the frayed hem of my sleeve, where Sarah's careful, uneven stitches held the fabric together. She made this for me when my hands were still calloused and stained with the grey dust of concrete mix, back when we lived in a drafty two-room apartment that smelled of cheap coffee and hope. Those were the years of sweat and heavy lifting, of laying the foundations of buildings I would eventually own. I was a young man then, driving rusted trucks through grueling 14-hour shifts, pulling steel and pouring concrete until my spine burned with exhaustion. Sarah would sit up late, waiting for me, her own hands tired from her job at the local bakery. Yet she always found the strength to mend my clothes and whisper that we would build a life we could be proud of. And we did. Together, we laid the brick and mortar of an empire. But when the wealth came, we realized it was a heavy, dangerous thing. We saw how easily gold could rot a person's soul, turning honest men into predators. When Sarah passed, I chose to step away from the glittering high society circles that hungered for our attention. I quietly placed my immense fortune into a private trust, choosing to live a simple, retired life in our modest suburban home. I wanted to protect Chloe from the toxic poison of unearned privilege. I wanted her to know the value of a dollar earned through honest sweat. For a long time she did. I remembered Chloe as a little girl, running to the front door when I came home from the construction sites. She didn't care about the dirt on my face. She would laugh and throw her small arms around my neck, calling me her hero. She was a sweet, humble child who found joy in the simplest things. But over the last few years, a slow, painful distance had crept in between us. It started when she met Julian. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his family began to rewrite her values. I watched with a heavy heart as she traded her genuine laughter for the rehearsed smiles of high society galas. She began to look at our modest home with a subtle hint of embarrassment. Julian's mother, Beatrice, with her venomous tongue and obsession with outward appearances, had steadily fed Chloe a daily diet of superficial vanity. Chloe began to believe that love was measured by the price tag of a wedding venue, and that respect was something you bought, not earned. She was slipping away from me, caught in the suffocating current of their gilded cage, completely blind to the fact that they saw her not as a human being, but as an accessory to their fragile social standing. I stood there on the edge of the grand stone terrace, the soft wind blowing off the distant ocean, carrying the faint, salty scent of the waves crashing against the cliffs below. The sound was a lonely, rhythmic echo that matched the quiet ache in my chest. Looking across the manicured lawns, I saw Chloe laughing with Julian's wealthy friends, her eyes bright but hollow. She didn't look like my little girl anymore. She looked like a stranger trapped in a beautiful, expensive prison. I realized then that my silence had not protected her. It had left her defenseless against these wolves. Beatrice thought she could humiliate me and sweep me under the rug, but she had no idea who she was truly dealing with. My daughter did not look me in the eye when they escorted me to table 14. It was not a table for guests, not really. It was a small, chipped wooden surface tucked into the darkest corner of the banquet hall, positioned directly beside the double-swinging doors of the industrial kitchen. Every few seconds, the doors would burst open, releasing the heavy scent of roasted garlic, dish soap, and the frantic whispered curses of the catering staff. While other tables boasted crystal decanters of imported wine, mine had a single plastic pitcher of lukewarm tap water. I sat there in my late wife's hand-stitched gray suit, feeling the draft from the service hallway chill my neck, completely isolated from the warmth and laughter of the main floor. This was Beatrice's silent declaration of war, a calculated move to push me into the shadows so her wealthy guests would not have to look at the man she deemed a beggar. A young waiter, carrying a tray of dirty plates, gave me a look of pure sympathy as he squeezed past my chair. From my vantage point, I watched Chloe. She sat at the head table, draped in white silk, looking like a delicate porcelain doll surrounded by wolves. Whenever her eyes drifted toward my lonely corner, she would quickly look away, her shoulders tensing as Beatrice whispered something sharp into her ear. I could see the fear in my daughter's posture, the way she clutched her wine glass so tightly her knuckles turned white. She was terrified of upsetting her new family, already conditioned to believe that keeping the peace meant sacrificing her own father's dignity. Beside her, Julian sat with a smug, easy posture. He saw where they had placed me. He had watched the coordinator lead me to the kitchen doors, and he had simply turned his head, sipping his expensive champagne as if I were nothing more than a ghost. His indifference was louder than any insult Beatrice could have yelled. It told me everything I needed to know about the man who was about to take my daughter's hand. He did not care about her happiness. He cared about her compliance. But my decades in the real estate market had taught me to look past grand facades to find the rot in the foundation. I began to study the Vance family. I listened to the clinking of heavy silverware, the muffled chatter, and the low, tense hum of polite conversation. To anyone else, this was effortless luxury. To me, it was a desperate performance. I watched Beatrice's husband, Richard, as he spoke to local developers. His laughter was too loud, his gestures too wide, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted his gold watch. I noticed Beatrice clutching her pearl necklace, a nervous habit when she felt out of control. They were projecting wealth they did not own. The expensive clothes, the rented estate, the haughty attitude, it was all a fragile shield. They were suffocating under a mountain of debt, and they saw my daughter not as a beloved addition, but as a financial life raft. I quietly reached into my pocket, my fingers brushing against the fabric Sarah had stitched with so much love. I felt no anger, only a cold, crystalline clarity. They thought they were burying me in the dark. They had no idea they had just shown me exactly where their armor was cracked. There is a point where silence stops being peaceful and becomes a battlefield, and I felt that transition the moment Beatrice stepped into the private library of the Grand Horizon estate. I had slipped into the room to find a brief moment of quiet before the ceremony, hoping to escape the suffocating arrogance of the wedding preparations. I was looking at an old book, my fingers resting gently on the worn cuff of my grey suit, when the heavy oak door clicked shut behind me. I turned to find Beatrice standing there, her eyes narrowed like a predator cornering its prey, holding a cheap plastic garment bag in her manicured hands. Without a word of greeting, she tossed the bag onto the mahogany desk between us with a heavy, rustling sound. She told me to put it on. She said she had paid $50 to rent a polyester tuxedo from a local shop down the road, and she expected me to change into it immediately. Her voice was flat, carrying a cold, calculated malice that made my stomach turn. She looked at my gray suit as if it were a heap of garbage, demanding that I take off the only physical connection I had left to my late wife. I looked down at the plastic bag, then back at Beatrice, my face remaining a mask of calm composure. I asked her if she really believed a piece of cheap, mass-produced plastic could replace a suit hand-stitched with love. I told her that my wife made this suit, and I would wear it to watch our daughter walk down the aisle. Beatrice let out a sharp, venomous laugh that seemed to bounce off the high ceilings of the library. She sneered, telling me she did not care about my pathetic, sentimental garbage. She said she refused to let her family's official wedding photos be ruined by a homeless-looking old man. She told me that her high society guests would be looking at her family, and she would not allow a ragged beggar in an outdated jacket to drag down their social standing. She demanded that I change my clothes or get out of her sight. The sheer audacity of her words hung in the air, thick and toxic. I could feel the anger trying to break through my defenses, but my decades of building a business empire had taught me that the loudest person in the room is often the weakest. I stood my ground, my posture straight and my gaze unwavering. I told her, with absolute clarity, that I would not change. Her face twisted in a mixture of rage and disbelief. She stepped closer, her expensive perfume choking the air between us. She whispered a final threat, telling me that if I did not put on the rental tuxedo within 5 minutes, she would call the estate's security team to have me forcibly dragged off the property in front of my own daughter. She said she would tell Chloe that I simply chose not to show up. In the sudden, suffocating silence that followed, the heavy ticking of the library's grandfather clock seemed to grow deafeningly loud. Each slow, rhythmic tick marked the end of my patience and the beginning of her downfall. Outside, the sky darkened rapidly, and a heavy rain began to patter against the glass windows, a dark shadow falling over the gilded estate. Beatrice thought she had backed me into a corner, completely unaware that she had just signed her family's financial death warrant. I did not feel anger as I closed the heavy oak door of the library behind me, only the cold, hard clarity that comes when a boundary has been crossed for the very last time. Beatrice believed she had cornered a helpless old man who could be easily discarded to preserve her fragile social standing. She had no idea that the faded grey suit she so deeply despised was worn by the very man who held the keys to her family's survival. I walked past the bustling kitchen, ignoring the whispers of the catering staff, and stepped out onto the stone veranda. The cool rain fell against my face, soaking my jacket. But I stood tall, feeling the familiar texture of Sarah's stitches beneath my fingers. They had tried to push me into the dark, but they had only succeeded in forcing my hand. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and pulled out my simple phone. I scrolled past the missed calls until I reached a name I had not dialed in years. Marcus. He was my trusted asset manager and legal advisor, the brilliant mind who had helped me structure my real estate empire under private trusts. The phone rang only once before a deep, steady voice answered. "Arthur," Marcus said, his tone instantly shifting to deep alert. "It has been a long time. I assume this is not a social call." "It is not, Marcus," I said, keeping my voice low. "I am standing on the terrace of the Grand Horizon estate. Tell me who owns this place." I heard the rapid clicking of a keyboard on the other end. "Give me 10 seconds, Arthur," he murmured, his voice filled with clinical precision. "The Grand Horizon is owned by Vanguard Hospitality Group. They are facing a severe liquidity crisis and are desperate for immediate capital to prevent a public default. They are practically begging for a buyer behind closed doors." I let out a slow breath, looking out over the manicured gardens now being washed away by the storm. "And what about the Vance family?" I asked. Marcus went silent for a moment, the clicking of his keyboard resuming. When he spoke again, there was a sharp edge to his voice. "Arthur, the Vance family operates a boutique investment firm, Vance Capital. They are heavily leveraged, holding over $40 million in toxic debt. Their primary creditor is a subsidiary of our own parent company, Apex Holdings. They are 30 days past due, and if we call in that debt, their entire firm collapses. They are on the absolute brink of ruin, trying to use your daughter's marriage as a financial lifeline." The pieces of the puzzle fell into place with a terrifying, beautiful symmetry. Beatrice's arrogance was nothing more than a desperate smokescreen to hide the rotting foundation of her family's empire. "Marcus," I said, my voice steady, carrying the weight of an absolute, unyielding authority. "I want you to initiate an immediate, aggressive buyout of the Vanguard Hospitality Group. Offer them cash, above market value, on the condition that the transfer of ownership of the Grand Horizon is finalized within the next 30 minutes. "Consider it done," Marcus replied. "And the Vance family?" "Buy their debt from our subsidiary," I commanded. "Acquire every single lien and promissory note they have signed. I want to own every single dollar they owe by the time my daughter walks down the aisle." I hung up the phone and looked up at the darkened sky. The storm was just beginning, and I was about to bring the rain. Get this pathetic old man out of my sight before he ruins my family's big day. The words cut through the elegant silence of the grand lobby like a rusted blade. I stood near the marble pillars, the fabric of my late wife's hand-stitched gray suit rough against my fingertips, facing Beatrice as she unleashed her final strike. She stood there, flanked by the venue manager and 2 security guards, her face twisted in a mask of triumph. She believed she had won, that her superficial world of rented luxury could easily crush a quiet father who chose to live in the shadows. "This beggar has refused to change into the tuxedo I provided, and now he is trespassing on private property," Beatrice sneered, her voice echoing off the high ceiling. "Do your job, Mr. Sterling, and throw him out. I will not have our guests subjected to this embarrassment for another second." The venue manager, Mr. Sterling, stepped forward. He looked at me with a mixture of professional disdain and cold indifference. To him, I was just an eyesore who did not belong in this playground of the ultra-wealthy. "Sir," Mr. Sterling said, his voice smooth but devoid of warmth, "I must ask you to leave the premises immediately. If you do not cooperate, my security team will escort you out." I looked him dead in the eye, my posture straight and my face entirely calm. I did not flinch. I merely stood my ground, carrying the quiet, formidable strength of a man who had built empires. "Are you certain you want to make that decision, Mr. Sterling?" I asked, my voice carrying a low, steady resonance that made the guards hesitate. Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Do not listen to his pathetic bluffing. Just drag him out." Mr. Sterling signaled the guards to move in. One of them reached out, his hand inches from the sleeve Sarah had sewn with so much love. But before his fingers could touch my jacket, a sharp, frantic ringtone shattered the tension. It was Mr. Sterling's phone. He frowned, instinctively reaching into his pocket, but as he looked at the screen, his hand froze. The caller ID displayed the chairman of the board of Vanguard Hospitality Group. Mr. Sterling's composure cracked in an instant. He quickly pressed the phone to his ear, his voice trembling. "Yes, Chairman? I am currently handling a small issue in the lobby." He listened. The silence in the lobby became absolute. I watched as the color slowly drained from Mr. Sterling's face, leaving him a ghostly white. His eyes widened, darting from the phone to me. His breathing became shallow, his polished facade completely crumbling as the voice on the other end delivered the earth-shattering news. The entire Vanguard Hospitality Group had just been bought out in cash by a single private entity. The transaction was finalized moments ago, and the new owner was standing right in front of him, wearing an old gray suit. Mr. Sterling let out a choked, terrified laugh, a sound of pure panic that bounced off the marble walls as his knees buckled. The guards stepped back, their faces filled with confusion, while Beatrice stared in stunned silence, her smug expression beginning to crack as she realized the ground beneath her feet had just completely vanished. The silence that followed the manager's sudden collapse was heavy, thick, with the realization of a power shift so absolute it left Beatrice utterly breathless. Mr. Sterling stood trembling, his head bowed, repeatedly apologizing to me in a hushed, desperate whisper. Beatrice tried to speak, her mouth opening and closing like a trapped bird, her polished veneer of high society dominance completely shattered. She looked at me, then at the security guards who had retreated into the shadows, and finally at the faded grey suit she had just tried to have thrown out. The very fabric she dismissed as garbage now represented the absolute ownership of everything around her. I stood tall, feeling the coarse thread of my late wife's stitches beneath my fingers, realizing that the quiet life I had chosen was no longer a shield, but a sword to protect the people I loved. I stepped closer to Beatrice, my voice calm, low, and completely devoid of anger. I told her that a person's worth is never measured by the label on their collar or the price tag of a rented ballroom. I told her that this suit, hand-stitched with love by my late wife, Sarah, held more genuine value than her entire family name. I revealed to her, in a quiet whisper, that her family's firm, Vance Capital, was now entirely under my control. I explained that Apex Holdings had just acquired their $40 million in toxic debt, and that her husband's nervous laughter would no longer hide their impending ruin. Her face drained of all color, realizing that with a single word, I could strip her of the very status she worshipped. I told her that her reign of arrogance and her cruelty toward my daughter were officially over. Yet, as I looked past her trembling shoulders, I saw Chloe standing near the entrance of the grand hall. She was watching me, her eyes filled with tears, a mixture of fear and sudden, overwhelming realization dawning upon her. She finally saw her father as the anchor she had almost lost. For her sake, and only for her sake, I decided to let the wedding continue. I would not ruin her day, but I would ensure she walked into her future free from the manipulation of the Vance family. I looked back at Beatrice and told her that she would sit in the audience. She would be silent, and she would show nothing but absolute respect to my daughter from this day forward. Beatrice could only nod, her hands shaking as she clutched her pearl necklace, completely humbled. I walked over to Chloe, offering my arm. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the rough, hand-stitched sleeve of my grey suit. She looked up at me, tears spilling over her cheeks, and whispered a quiet apology that washed away years of distance. Together, we walked down the aisle of the grand estate I now owned. The guests watched us in silence, no longer daring to judge, sensing the immense, quiet power that walked beside the bride. As the music played, I felt Sarah's presence close to me, her love woven into the very fabric of my jacket. I realized then that true dignity cannot be bought or rented. It is built through honest sweat, kept alive through unconditional love, and carried quietly in the heart of a man who knows exactly who he is.